Hello and welcome to From Rewatch with Love, a James Bond rewatch podcast celebrating most of the history of the James Bond movie franchise, leading up to the, at this moment, presumed release date of the 25th James Bond movie, No Time to Die. My name is Graham Stark from LoadingReadyRun. Joining me is Matt Wiggins.
Hi there.
Longtime movie watching buddy, as well as co-host of our other rewatch countdown thing podcast, very similar themed podcast, Countdown to Infinity, that you do, of course, with James, which was leading up to the release of Avengers Endgame and now Beyond.
And now Beyond, except that there hasn't been a Beyond yet.
Has there not? There hasn't been anything.
Well, there was Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Following Endgame.
It's going to be a lot longer before there's another episode of this one. Because this is going to be weekly up until No Time to Die releases, and then probably nothing for another 3 to 4 years.
But there will be a new Bond at that point, probably.
That's true.
I guess we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, fair point. So what are we trying to do with this podcast? Well, we both really love the James Bond movies. I remember fondly watching whenever they would all show up on like some all-day marathon on TV. I bought all the collections on DVD because of the awesome bonus features, and then eventually again on Blu-ray, and been seeing them in theaters since probably GoldenEye, because that would have been the first one for several years at that point. Obviously, a lot of my interaction with the James Bond franchise will have been the GoldenEye video game. That's probably in terms of hours interacted with franchise, it might be the video game, but I have watched these movies a lot.
That's probably similar for me. I have spent what I would describe as a probably unhealthy amount of time playing GoldenEye 007 on the N64, and probably similarly an unhealthy amount of time watching the Bond movies over the decades of my life. But I think you're right. I think the video game probably wins.
I just think the movies are really fun. They're very interesting, frankly. I mean, this is the first. It's easy to talk about a movie franchise now in the world of Marvel, and even things that had a definitive beginning and end when you look at like the Harry Potter movie franchise. But this was a big thing. This was an unusual event when it happened, to have this big blockbuster. In many ways, the Bond films are considered the first cinema blockbusters, to have this ongoing thing with a recurring cast. And I mean, not to say there weren't pulp films prior to this earlier in cinematic history, but the Bond films are a very interesting and unique thing that, from a production perspective, I am always fascinated by, and not the least of which is how they have managed to reinvent themselves over the years, not just with obviously the very visual changes in the actor portraying James Bond himself, but also in style and tone and the way that the movies are produced. And I think it's just fascinating to look at.
Yeah, I agree. I was doing some digging through various articles on the James Bond franchise today, and one of the recurring themes that you see in writing about the franchise is the way that James Bond movies have sort of formed a genre all unto themselves, and it adapts and changes and sort of updates itself and reinvents itself where it's necessary to, but they're not like really any other action movie. Like, if you're not a fan of the Bond movies, you maybe are like, oh well, they're just an action movie or whatever, but they're not. They're really like a James Bond movie. When you describe that to somebody, or when you invoke that sort of term, invokes a very specific like image of what that movie is going to contain and what you're going to get out of a Bond movie, in a way that'll, like, I think Marvel has sort of done the same thing now. Like, you say it's a Marvel movie and you know what you're going to get from a Marvel movie, and it's going to be probably a lot of fun and you'll enjoy it a lot, but like they almost don't like match up with like an action movie within their own genre. Like they're their own thing, and the Bond movies have sort of very much gone the same way. Yeah, it's a neat parallel in how both of those movies or both of those franchises have sort of like come to own their respective genre space.
That's very true. And it was interesting rewatching Dr. No for the howeverth time with probably my most critical eye, because it's like, oh, I'm going to have to record a podcast about this, to see how many things that make a James Bond film, how many things that we know of as like a tenet of the James Bond cinematic language were established in this very first movie, more than I thought. I had in my head, I had sort of got it that Dr. No was, it was like, okay, cool. It was a good spy movie. They did what they needed to do. And then they sort of crystallized what a James Bond movie would look like over the next several Sean Connery films. And that's not the case. This is like, oh yeah, this is a James Bond movie, like right from the start, which I was impressed to discover.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. I think it definitely functions like, there are some format differences and things in this film that are a little bit there, and what, like, I'm sure we'll get to it, but this movie is 100% the prototype of the films that would follow it. I think that's neat. I had a similar like, oh, it's not quite as put together as the other ones. No, actually, it's like easily 90% of the way there right out of the gate.
Yeah, they came out swinging. So before we get into discussing Dr. No, because the way that this podcast is going to work is we're going to go through each movie. We're going to talk, generally speaking, first about the cold open, which is the pre-title sequence. Interestingly, in the case of Dr. No specifically, the pre-title comes after the opening titles. That part of the format they would work out later. We'll talk about the opening titles and the theme song, and then we'll talk about the synopsis of the entire movie, discussing things that we liked and didn't like and trivia and stuff over the course of the movie, and then we'll round out with our thoughts at the end. But before we get into talking about Dr. No in particular, just something we want to talk about for the franchise as a whole.
Yeah. So as we've mentioned, our goal with this podcast is to share with you our love of the James Bond films. And whether you're a fan of the Bond movies yourself or new to the franchise, we want to bring you with us on that journey and share in this thing that we love. But Graham and I both believe that it's important to acknowledge the problematic aspects of things you love. And the James Bond movies are very problematic. The character of James Bond in these movies functions basically as an indulgence in an idealized form of masculinity, and it's really, in most of the films, delivered pretty uncritically and in a way that like really rarely ever grapples with the toxicity of that depiction. And, James Bond, he gets to be cool, he gets to be suave, he gets to be debonair, he gets to save the world on the sharpness of his wit and on, grit and determination. He gets to wear nice clothes and drink nice drinks and travel to exotic places. He always has a witty quip, and, to use the aphorism that or the cliche that sort of always surrounds the Bond movies, all the women want him and all the men want to be him. And there's this sort of romance of the ideal man that draws audiences to the box office time after time. We're heading into the 25th Bond film. But it warrants noting that James Bond is also unambiguously a violent, self-destructive, emotionally repressed killer and a rapist. Consequently, the relationship of these movies with women is fraught, to say the least. The term Bond girl has become commonplace in culture, and there's typically one or two such characters appearing in each film, normally functioning as a sexual conquest of Bond to be used and discarded throughout the film, or rescued as the turns of the plot require. It will be basically impossible for us to comment on these films without discussing these characters on the terms that the film presents them. So, all that aside, we do recognize that these films often feature troubling behavior, and they reinforce a kind of masculine ideal that can be seriously damaging to both men and women alike. But analysis of the sexual politics of James Bond isn't really going to be the lens that we use to discuss these movies. We're here to celebrate the best aspects of the film or of the films, and to look at the best of Bond and not get mired in the worst of it. That said, the Bond films are a problematic fave for us. And so we do want to acknowledge that up front. And we will probably share some writing and some examinations of Bond's relationship to women and gender roles in these films that were, that have been written by other authors. And we'll try to include those in the description of this video.
Absolutely. Well said. And we have several pieces of writing that we've earmarked to include in the description for that purpose.
Additionally, we would encourage you, the listener, to share with us any writing you found that you think does a good job of examining these subjects. And if we see anything that we think people might enjoy reading, we will look to include it in the description of a future episode.
And so, with all of that said, let us take a look at the very first James Bond movie, Dr. No, from 1962, directed by Terence Young, who worked with Sean Connery some years prior in the movie Action of the Tiger, which I ordered a Blu-ray copy of and have not yet had time to watch. Because I wanted to see an earlier movie from Terence Young, because it's like, an action movie with Sean Connery. Sean Connery's not a big role in it either, with the same director. Is this sort of like what got him the gig on James Bond? Because Terence Young, had a body of work leading up to this, but I was sort of curious. You can't find it online, obviously.
Right.
Herbert Lom is in it. He played the long-suffering detective or chief of police in the Pink Panther movies, the one that Inspector Clouseau slowly sends quite mad. Anyway, screenplay by Richard Maybaum, Joanna Harwood, and Berkeley Mather, with Wolf Mankiewicz as a uncredited partner of Richard Maybaum in the first version of the script that was very different from the Ian Fleming novel. We should say, James Bond is based on a series of novels by author Ian Fleming. They were very popular in their day, very pulp novels, but very, very popular. And the producers, Albert R., known as Cubby Broccoli, and Harry Saltzman, felt that the initial script treatment had to hew much closer to the original novel than the first script treatment, to the point that Wolf Mankiewicz, who in fact was the person who brought Saltzman and Broccoli together to work on this project, didn't have faith in their version of it and asked for his name to be removed.
Huh. Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. The terms of Saltzman and Broccoli coming together was essentially that for many years, Broccoli had wanted to make a movie of James Bond, thought it would be great, couldn't get anyone on board with the notion, and eventually split with his producing partner. And to him, the James Bond movies were almost like the white whale of this thing that he really, really wanted to make. And separately, Saltzman, having split with his production partner, had acquired the movie rights to the James Bond franchise from Ian Fleming, but only for 6 months. So he was on a deadline, and then they were put together. It was like, you two should work together on this. And they went to United Artists and pitched it to a group of folks at United Artists, one of whom was a huge James Bond fan, and was like, really? I'm listening. Fascinating. And there it goes. And do you know, I don't know how much sort of production details you might have done for this. Do you know what the budget for Dr. No was?
I'm looking at it right now.
In its day, $1.1 million.
Yeah.
Adjusted for inflation.
Yeah.
$9.4 million.
Oh, wow.
Which is ludicrous. Because you look at this movie, making this movie today, it's like 30, 40 million easily.
Yeah.
Movies were made differently in the 60s, right?
No doubt.
I mean, you're looking at a lot of location filming in Jamaica, and surely the money would have gone farther. There's a bit in the special features where they talk about the big climactic explosions, and some people are flying off the jetty or whatever. And apparently the producers were like, all right, any background extra wants to jump off the jetty, I'll give you an extra $5. Right? It's like, that's the right. But it's like, still, this movie was made for the equivalent today of $9.4 million. It doesn't seem possible in the way that movies are made today.
Yeah, I mean, you said that, and I looked up the budget of SPECTRE just to compare. And SPECTRE's budget, I mean, we'll get there eventually, but SPECTRE's budget was somewhere between $245 and $300 million.
Exactly. It's absolutely ludicrous. And it ran over budget to the point that United Artists was petrified that this movie would tank. And it ended up, I've adjusted this for inflation as well. So again, on an adjusted budget of $9.4 million, Dr. No worldwide has taken in $510 million.
That's quite something, isn't it? Yeah. Look at the number. Like, I'm looking at the numbers here on Wikipedia, and it's like budget $1.1 billion, box office in 1962 dollars, of course, $59.5 million, and a 60-to-1 return. Like, that's bank. That's a solid return. There's little wonder that this got greenlit for a sequel.
Yeah, and they were in the 60s. They were making one of these a year. You know, it was very, very prolific. So the movie begins right with the opening titles. Well, it begins with the classic shot of looking down the gun barrel, which is actually a photo of a real gun barrel. The opening title designer who would work on James Bond for decades, Maurice Binder, took a photo of a actual gun barrel with a pinhole camera.
Really?
Yeah, which I had no idea that was true.
That's incredible.
And the actor that you see, you know, James Bond there in this movie and for the next several movies is Sean Connery's stuntman, Bob Simmons.
Ah.
Because they were done principal photography at this point. So it does the gun barrel blood thing and then into these very 1960s, very pop opening titles of Dr. No with the music, with the song Under the Mango Tree.
Yes.
There's no theme song. There's no title track for this movie.
Well, it does go into the classic Bond theme for a bit and then transitions into the mango tree and then transitions to yet a third song. The thing that always strikes me is that this one does like the full version of the like intro Bond theme and not like a truncated version of it, just sort of throwing back reference like the future films will. This is one where it's like they haven't quite nailed down the order of the opening, and they haven't quite nailed down what a Bond opening looks like, but you can see that all the elements are there and sort of like coming together.
Yeah, because it just sort of does some stuff with circles sort of flashing around the screen, and then randomly and without warning is colored silhouettes of women doing the twist, and then some other silhouettes of three blind men walking with canes while a cover of Three Blind Mice comes in, and it's very sort of like, what's happening? There was no expectation for any of this. It's interesting that you mentioned, of course, the James Bond theme in an interview. Peter Hunt, the editor, who we'll be talking about a lot when we get to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he talked about how the theme song came in very late in the process. And when they finally nailed the theme song, he was like, I just put that in anywhere when it was like James Bond is about to or has just done a thing. And it's very obvious that the theme song, it just sort of gets thrown around the soundtrack quite a lot. I think he leaned on it maybe a little much. So there's no formal title track to talk about, but the opening titles certainly lay the groundwork for what would become the iconic James Bond opening title sequence.
Absolutely. So with that out of the way, shall we move on to the plot?
Yeah, because ordinarily we would talk about the another sort of Bond classic of the cold open, which is typically Bond doing something unrelated, just finishing a mission, some kind of, usually some grand stunt that is like, hey, remember this? It's James Bond. And then the opening titles, and then this movie actually starts. Whereas in this case, we have the opening titles, then it goes to I guess you would call it a cold open. It's a prologue. It doesn't involve Bond. It's just sort of laying the groundwork. And then we dissolve to London at the end of it. And I guess that is this movie's intro, but there's no big stunt or anything. It's just part of the narrative of the movie. So yeah, let's talk about what happens in Dr. No.
So, as previously mentioned, the opening titles transition from the Bond theme and circles into women doing the twist and Under the Mango Tree, and then into Three Blind Mice. And we open the film following three blind men as they walk along. And we transition over to John Strangways, the British intelligence agent who is stationed in Jamaica. And he is sitting around hanging out at a gentleman's club, and he has to go check in with MI6. So he excuses himself from the table and the friends that he's sitting with, and heads over to his car in order to place heads over to his car in order to place a call back to his house where his secretary is stationed, and proceeds to begin to call in when he passes the three blind men. As he begins to make his call, he is assassinated. It turns out that the three blind men that were walking by were in fact assassins sent to kill him. So they kill him, they haul him into a hearse, and it drives off, and we then relocate back to his secretary at Strangway's house, and she also subsequently is assassinated by these three assassins, who then steal a dossier, or they steal a couple of dossiers, one named Crab Key and one named Dr. No. So this leads to the bringing in of Bond into the fray. He's called into MI6, and we get the debut of Moneypenny and Bond's sort of flirtatious relationship with Moneypenny, as well as M, and Bond's sort of irreverent eschewing of M's authority, and M's sort of hyper competent assertion of his authority in the intervening conversation.
I want to jump back briefly to the scene just before MI6, which is our actual formal introduction to James Bond, because we go from the goings on in Jamaica to a scene of the people on the other end of the radio realizing that they've lost contact with their men in Jamaica, and then we go to a gentleman's club.
Oh, right.
Which is apparently where Saltzman and Broccoli would hang out in London. Must be nice. Although what we see of the interior is a set, and then we see Bond, not that we know it's him yet, we see people playing Baccarat, because again, in Casino Royale, the original, it was Baccarat, not Texas Hold'em as it was in the movie, but then Texas Hold'em was more relevant to current culture at the time. And they do this very interesting thing where we see the game, we hear people talking, and Bond is shot in close-ups of his hand playing the cards from behind. You don't see him up until the woman sitting across from him, who he is absolutely soaking at this game of Baccarat. Sylvia Trench, asks him his name, and he, with a cigarette dangling from his lip as he attempts to light it, informs her that he is Bond, James Bond. Which apparently, according to American Film Institute, is number it's in the 30s or 40s on best film quotes of all time or whatever.
I'm amazed that it's that low.
I know. It's just it's such a great introduction of this slow reveal, and he's, for some reason, the dangling cigarette, it's not dangling, but for some reason the fact that he says this line with the cigarette stuck to his lip is kind of great. He's just I don't care. He's not putting on airs. He's just I'm just introducing myself. I'm playing Baccarat, and I'm absolutely destroying you. He's taking her to the cleaners.
It's such a good scene too, as he gets up to leave, and she follows him out the door, and they basically agree to meet up the next day. And he finds out that she golfs, and he's like, all right, well, how about lunch and we go golfing tomorrow? And just gives her his card and leaves. It's that whole scene is a very good introduction to the sort of effortless coolness of Sean Connery in this role, because he is just effortlessly cool through this entire scene.
And there are so many stories surrounding the casting of James Bond, looking for the right person. It's who should play him? David Niven is a name that gets thrown around a lot. Amusingly, he would later play James Bond in the Casino Royale parody movie that we're probably going to do an episode about. He's the quintessential, debonair Englishman actor at the time. But, there's so many apocryphal stories. And what it came down to is they had seen Sean Connery in other movies and were like, gosh, he'd be great for it. In particular, they saw him in the Disney movie Darby O'Gill and the Little People. I don't know if you remember that movie. They saw him in it, and they were like, oh, this guy's great, even though obviously the movie was completely different in tone.
This is our James Bond.
Yeah.
All right, so back on track.
Yeah.
He gets to M's office. He's dressed down, in fact, by M right out of the gate over the fact that he's still using a Beretta and hasn't hasn't upgraded his weapon to the current standard issue for MI6 agents. And there's like a whole scene where it's like, no, you're going to use a Walther PPK. You have a license to kill, not a license to die.
It's interesting too that the PPK is so inherently part of Bond's sort of, it's like James Bond, he drinks a vodka martini, shaken not stirred, he uses a Walther PPK, and it's because M is like, that Beretta that you love so much sucks. You're going to use this one now.
And he tries to leave with it.
Oh,
like
yeah.
At the end of the conversation, they've given him the PPK, and he's like got it in his holster, and he picks up the gun box that they've given him, and he like scoops the Beretta up with it. And as he's walking out, M is just like, 007, leave the Beretta.
So it's funny too, because the production order of these movies doesn't necessarily follow the books, and in many cases the movies would wildly diverge from the books. But when M says, on your last mission your Beretta jammed, in the books the mission that he's referring to there is retrieving the Lecter in From Russia with Love, which would be the next movie. It's just kind of funny that it's like, it's this weird circular thing of where the referencing the story from the book of the movie that would be next. And anyway, from a production angle, one shout out, I've always loved Bernard Lee as M. He was really good at just not putting up with any of James Bond's crap, and he would play M for a very long time through several Bonds. Lois Maxwell, of course, as Moneypenny, a similar sort of deal. She would be Moneypenny for a very long time through many James Bonds as well. And the character of the quartermaster giving Bond his PPK, there's no fancy gadget. It's just a gun. He's just giving him a good functional gun. That character is credited as Major Boothroyd, who would be played in follow-up movies by Desmond Llewellyn, better known as Q for quartermaster. But technically, Major Boothroyd, Q as played by Desmond Llewellyn, is referred to as Major Boothroyd, I think, once in one of the movies. It is meant to be the same character from the books, but this is just a guy that shows up and gives him a gun, and that's all.
Yeah.
But the gadgets, that aspect, despite what I said earlier, that aspect of what you imagine when you think of a Bond movie is not really focused on in this particular film.
Mm-hmm. I think the closest he gets to a gadget in this one is a Geiger counter,
which ends up being very important. But yeah, you're right. It's not super not super critical.
Boy. All right. So back to the story. He's in M's office and he's given his mission. He's going to be dispatched to Jamaica, and he's supposed to try and figure out what happened to Strangways and why he disappeared. As a component of this investigation, he's supposed to meet up with the CIA agent who is stationed in Jamaica, Felix Leiter, who is working on a case relating to the disruption of rocket launches from Cape Canaveral, which will it barely comes up throughout the movie what the actual villainous plot is. It's actually hilarious how little the villainy is relevant to this movie.
Okay, good. I'm glad it wasn't just me, because I was like, later in the movie when he's like sending this reactor critical, I was like, oh, he just beat Dr. No. What was he doing again? What was Dr. No's plan here? And I was afraid I'd missed something.
Nope, you sure haven't. It's Dr. No was using radio beams from Crab Key. I'm jumping ahead now, but Dr. No was using radio beams to interfere with rocket launches from Cape Canaveral as part of a plan to destabilize the space race between Russia and the US. But it comes up exactly twice in the whole film, and one of them is in this opening scene with Q. Or with M, rather. He's got an entire island and an entire elaborate underground lair and a whole evil henchman workforce operating a radioactive mine and operating a nuclear reactor on this island, and it's so that he can generate a strong radio beam.
Yep. Is it ever clear why he wants to do that? Money, I guess. Is it power? Money?
It's sort of I'll get to that.
Okay.
I'll come back to that. So anyhow, Bond goes to Jamaica. He arrives at the airport. There's a bunch of shifty characters watching him at the airport. He walks out and begins to hail a taxi and is greeted by a driver who claims to have been sent by Government House. So Bond is like, all right, well, can you take care of the bags while I go check my reservation at my hotel? And the driver's like, no, I can do that. He's like, no, just worry about the bags. He goes to the phone booth, calls over to Government House, and of course is like, did you send a driver? They're like, no, I thought you didn't want a driver. Quite right. Okay, how about lunch this afternoon? And he goes and hops in the car with the driver, having now determined that he's not above board.
That is an ongoing thing that James Bond does, which is not tell people that he's on side with when something is wrong. Like, he could have easily told the person at Government House, okay, someone did send a car, so, you know, if something doesn't happen to me, no, none of that. He's like, oh, okay, cool. Thanks for the info. Goodbye. Like, I'll take care of this.
My favorite line in that whole interaction is the like, all right, so lunch, 1:00? Forgive me if I'm a little late.
Yeah. I do also like that there's several different shifty looking people watching him that you are led to believe are all affiliated, and it is revealed later that they are not. This is something that I really like in sort of spy and heist movies. This would come up. I think my favorite iteration of this is from Live and Let Die, and we'll talk about that when we get there.
Now we're in the car. Driver's driving along and going pretty fast, and Bond notices, and the driver lets him know that, oh, he thinks they're being followed. So Bond tells the guy to lose him, instructs him to turn off a side street, well, onto a gravel road, and he does, and they evade the person following them. But Bond takes this opportunity to, you know, pull out his gun and hold it to the driver to get him to talk. You know, who are you? Why are you? I happen to know that you're not with Government House. What is your mission? Why have you picked me up? And the driver first makes an attempt at a gun in order to try and kill Bond, and then once he has been subdued and disarmed, says he'll talk but asks for a cigarette. Bond, you know, helps him grab a cigarette. It turns out that this agent, this driver, has had a cyanide capsule embedded in one of his cigarettes, and so he commits suicide rather than talk to Bond and poisons himself.
That's a very 1960s interaction, by the way, that the guy's like, okay, you beat me and I'll talk. Can I have a cigarette first? And the Bond's like, oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. I'm not a monster. Yeah, go on, have a cigarette. Yeah, I like that he's like, oh, yeah, all right, sure.
The sort of like nonchalance with which he just like pulls out the guy's cigarette pack and just hands it to him as well. Like, you don't know, maybe he's got a cigarette gun. He doesn't even check them. He's just like, oh, here, have one of your own cigarettes. But anyhow, he piles the guy into the car and drives to Government House to meet his contact. He is the chief secretary at Government House.
Right, because at this time, at time of filming, this is kind of amusing. At time of filming, Jamaica was still a province in the Federation of the West Indies, which was under the control of the UK. It was a United Kingdom colony, and Jamaica would gain its independence. I think Jamaica became independent between filming and release. Yes.
Oh, wow.
Dr. No was released October 5th, 1962, and Jamaica gained independence August 6th, 1962.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it is still a part of the Commonwealth. So technically the Queen is the head of state of Jamaica, but they are no longer a colony, and they're no longer part of the West Indies Federation. Right. So that's why there's a Government House and there's a secretary for Jamaica and all that. Colonialism. That's going to come up from time to time too. Oh yeah.
So Bond meets with the chief secretary at Government House. You know, we learned that the chief secretary and Strangways, and it turns out another man, a professor, can I remember geology. His name? A professor of geology, Dent. Professor Dent were three of the people that were hanging out at the Gentleman's Club at the beginning of the film. So the chief secretary directs Bond back to Strangways' house. Bond goes to Strangways' house, starts searching around. In his initial investigation of Strangways, he finds a picture of Strangways with a boat and a boat captain. Determines that the man is named Quarrel. So he heads off to find Quarrel down at the docks and see if he can get some information from him. He also recognizes Quarrel as the man that was driving the car that was chasing him while he was being chased in the car with the driver of indeterminate origin. He makes his way down to the docks, meets up with Quarrel. Quarrel is not particularly inclined to talk to Bond. He would really doesn't want to give him the time of day, and so he makes his way off. Bond follows him, and they end up in a bar. In the bar, Quarrel is like, "All right, fine, I'll talk, but can we go somewhere private?" And basically indicates to Bond that he should join him in the storeroom. And in the storeroom, the barkeep as well as Quarrel corner Bond and attack him. Bond manages to fend them off and get the upper hand, only for another man to walk through the door and hold a gun to the back of Bond's head and disarm him, who then reveals himself to be none other than CIA agent Felix Leiter. And upon determining that they're on the same side and that they don't mean each other any harm, Leiter returns Bond's gun, and they proceed to sort of like Bond wins Quarrel over, and they proceed to make some headway on sharing information.
I just want to briefly call out a scene that happened in the midst of all of that, of Bond at his hotel room. There's this honestly quite long scene shot very calmly and methodically of Bond walking around his hotel room, checking it. He puts fingerprint dust on the combination locks on his briefcase. He wipes a hair from his head across the door to his closet so that he can tell if it's been opened. And there's no music. It's just this really methodical, like you're just watching him do his job. And it's this really nice scene that I really appreciate the pacing of, because this is in terms of the movies being of their era, this is not a scene you would get today. It's a very calmly paced moment of Bond just being like, okay, I need to take care of a few things to make sure that I'm safe from a spy perspective before I go and start investigating stuff, because obviously people know I'm here.
So now
we're at a party.
They're all hanging out at the bar. It's evening. They're sharing information. They get talking about the offense that they're all aware of. So it turns out that Quarrel has been serving as like the boatman for Strangways and has been sort of like taking him around, and they went and they took rock samples from a variety of different places, including Crab Key, on a subsequent visit, or it might have been the previous visit, but on a visit to Strangway's house, Bond finds a receipt for Professor Dent's geological services to basically assess some rocks. That piece kind of falls together. Additionally, at this point, Bond is photographed by a girl who also tried to take his picture at the airport. He gets Quarrel to bring her over. He pulls the film out of her camera and asks her why she's trying to get a photo of him. She claims to be working freelance for the local newspaper. Bond gets a confirmation from the bar owner that, she's been around from time to time. My memory is failing me at the moment. I think the gist of this conversation is that she's actually been like paid to get photographs of him for interested parties that we may or may not know who they are at this point.
Yeah, it's very methodical spy stuff, which I quite like. He's like, who are you working for? She says this newspaper, and then he calls the bar owner over and is like, do you know her? Yeah, she's around here often. He's like, okay, call the newspaper, see if they sent her down. And she's like, up, they wouldn't. I'm freelance. I'm just here on my own. And they're like, uh-huh. And then she attacks Quarrel, who completely no-sells, having glass scraped across his face.
Right.
Because he's hard as hell. And yeah, eventually they're like, all right, you can go. They just let her go because they're like, we're not going to get anything out of you, because Quarrel threatens to break her arm and she refuses to talk. And they're like, okay. She was going to let Quarrel break her arm. This other guy killed himself.
Right.
Who around here is putting so much fear into the people working for him that they're willing to die or get maimed to not spill the beans? What's going on?
And that's where we get the indication that like people in this area are basically living in fear of a Dr. No who owns the island of Crab Key. Anytime anybody goes to Crab Key, they never come back or end up dead or go missing forever, which, if I'm an evil villain, I definitely want to create an island where people visit my island and never come back ever again. And that will certainly not cast any suspicion on me ever.
My only problem with the characterization of Quarrel, who otherwise is great, and I really like his initial interactions with Bond when he's just sort of completely no-selling Bond, and that they're engaged in sort of equal footing of conversational barbs, is that when asked about Crab Key, that Coral is like, oh no, we don't go there, there's a dragon. And Bond's like, what? He's like, oh yeah, big flame breathing dragon that I really truly believe in is an actual dragon. And it's like, you seem too smart to be that superstitious, but okay, I guess.
I love the fact that when we do finally see the dragon, it is like so hilariously, obviously not a dragon.
And I mean, how stupid is the character of Honey Rider when we see the tank treads in the sand and she goes, oh yeah, dragon tracks.
Now do you believe me?
It's like, oh, come on, guys. Come on. Bond's surrounded by idiots. Anyway.
Yeah. Oh, man. Bond starts snooping around Professor Dent's office. He drops by with the receipt and is like, hey, I'm trying to figure out what happened to Strangways, and I found this receipt that he brought some rocks in. Obviously, what did you find? Were they valuable? And Dent says, nope, they were normal rocks.
They were iron pyrite. They were nothing.
Yeah. And Bond is like, huh, okay, well, thank you. And proceeds to call in a Geiger counter from MI6, and it shows up, and he goes to Coral's boat and is like, where were the samples? Coral's like, oh, about where your feet were. And he checks them, and they're super radioactive, to the extent that he comments like, have a look at these Geiger counter readings, Felix. Look at how radioactive these are. Thinks that it is somewhat unusual that a geologist who had studied a bunch of extremely radioactive rocks from a place nearby would not comment on the fact that these rocks were unusual at all, and in fact would say, they're not unusual at all. So he starts to suspect that Dent is in cahoots with whatever's going on. At the same time, Dent heads off to Crab Key to have a meeting with none other than Dr. No, and we learn that Dent has been tasked with killing Bond, that the driver was in Dent's employ and had been hired to kill Bond and had failed to do so. So in what I think is probably my favorite scheme in this entire movie, and the scene leading up to it is great, he instructs, he's angry at Dent for coming in daylight in the first place. He's like, you know the procedure, you don't come in daylight, you've disturbed me and you've violated procedure. Why? Don't fail me again. What's wrong with you?
And we don't see Dr. No in any of this. This is all voiceover in this amazing room.
Which is a chair in a corner with a giant vent with a light shining through it, casting gridded shadows across the back of the room. It's an amazing room.
I will only ever gush if given half an option about Ken Adams. Unsung is not the right word, but I think someone who, to the general public, does not get enough credit for how James Bond films look and feel, because he designs for many, many, many of the early Bond films all the amazing sets that are just these larger than life spaces that just sell the scale of a James Bond film. And to the point that, when Austin Powers came out, it was doing a parody of this movie, right? Like the whole scene at the end in the reactor and everything was a direct parody of the reactor scene in this movie. These amazing sets and this bizarre, marble floored, lattice roofed, solitary chair in the Naughty Time corner. This it just is, it immediately gets across what kind of person is Dr. No? What are we dealing with here? The scale of this room is just so wild. Apparently, the entire time they were on location filming in Jamaica, they were like, all right, Ken, you got this stage at Pinewood Film Studios, go ham. And Ken was like, okay, and just made these amazing sets. And they would become an iconic sort of visual shorthand of the James Bond films for many years. I love Ken Adams' designs.
Yeah, I love this room too. I love your description of the Naughty Time corner, because it really is. What is this room even for, right? It is a giant square marble floored room, except one entire corner of the room has a platform, it's almost like a stage, right? He has to step down from the platform onto the floor of the room. There's just a single salt chair, and it's just like a wooden chair, right? Like it's just a normal wooden chair. It's not a fancy chair.
Yeah.
Sitting over in the corner. And then there's a table on the other side of the room just off of shot.
Yeah.
What, like the whole corner of the room being blocked off? It's not like they can use this as a meeting room. It is literally the room where Dr. No lectures people who have failed him. It's like, it is the perfect room for that and that only.
You know how some people have like a present wrapping room, right? Like this tells you a lot about Dr. No. He has a room to dress down subordinates.
But it is an iconic piece of design. You could look at a screenshot of that room with none of the actors in it, and you'd be like, oh, this is definitely a set from a Bond movie.
Yeah.
So anyhow.
So what's the plan?
He's like, no, I've got a much better plan. You will not fail me again if you use this plan. Walk over to the table. And he walks over to the table, and there's a little cage sitting on the table. He's like, look inside the cage. And there is a tarantula inside the cage. And he's like, take this with you and use it to kill Bond tonight. And so Strangways obediently picks up the tarantula cage and walks out of the room.
So the 1960s, we didn't have planet Earth. You know, I assume general public knowledge of tarantulas was a lot more, oh, but like, this is the dumbest plan.
It is the dumbest plan. I love it so much. It like this movie, it comes out of the gate real strong with like hopelessly impractical ways to kill people. Yeah. Because like, go. My flawless plan is that you will set loose a tarantula in James Bond's hotel room, and it will certainly kill him. And then later in the film, there's like, chain this person to a slight incline and let the tide come in.
Oh, I got a funny story about that, but we'll get there.
That's a thing that people did, but it's if you just want to dispose of somebody, there are easier ways to do it.
Just shoot them. Just shoot them with a gun. How is it that Dent got close enough to Bond to release this tarantula into his hotel room and couldn't just shoot him in the head?
Yeah, exactly. And it's not like just release it into his hotel room, because like the movie does not acknowledge this at all. But the next time we see the tarantula, Bond is asleep in bed and then wakes up and then looks down at the sheets, and the sheets are moving. So somehow we assume that he just released the tarantula into the room, and the tarantula was like, a human to feast on, and made a beeline for Bond. But really, more accurately, if we were actually going to enact this plot in real life, you'd pretty much have to insert the tarantula under the bed sheets, right?
Mm-hmm. Put the fangs directly into the other person. You'll notice from a production perspective that there's two shots that we see of the tarantula. One close-up shot of it really clearly crawling over the arm and shoulders of Bond, and then one medium shot where you can see Sean Connery's face and the spider kind of unconvincingly, I guess, floating sort of just above his arm. That's because the close-up shots are stuntman Bob Simmons brought in to do pickups when they didn't have enough convincing footage of Sean Connery's face with the spider, because Sean Connery, in real life, absolutely petrified of spiders.
Oh, yeah.
So the reason it looks weird is because the tarantula is on a piece of glass.
Oh.
When Bond moves slightly and the tarantula does not perfectly move in sync with him, that's because the tarantula is not, in fact, upon his person.
Ah, that explains it. I mean,
yeah.
No judgment against Sean Connery here. I would be, given how close that spider is to his face in the shot where it's climbing off his shoulder onto the pillow.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to have that spider that close to my face either.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care that it's not actually probably fatal. I don't care that I'm being paid an ungodly sum of money. Please, please don't put the spider that close to my face.
Yep.
So anyhow, we moved ahead a little bit, but Bond at this point has, the spider gets released into Bond's room, and it climbs up his body, and he waits and waits and waits perfectly still until it just happens to step off his face and onto his pillow, at which point he yeets the pillow off the bed and manages to leap across the bed, grabbing a shoe, and just absolutely mashes the hell out of this spider with an incredible sound cue to go with it. It's like,
oh, there's an orchestra sting, yeah.
as he hits it like 3 or 4 times with the heel of his shoe. Naturally, Dent's attempt on his life fails. So the next day, there's a whole sequence in here where Bond like seduces a woman, and I don't remember what her relationship is to the rest of the film. Was she like Dent's secretary? Or no, she was the chief secretary's secretary, because she was listening into the office when Bond was giving the chief secretary an update on the state of the mission.
Yes, that's Miss Taro. He's talking to the secretary, and then she's listening in, and he's like, "Oh, whatever, you wanna hang out sometime?" And he goes over to her house, or at least attempts to. Now, I do have to talk about this, and this will come up again when we talk about Dr. No. But Miss Taro, who is meant to be Chinese, is played by the distinctly not Chinese actress Zena Marshall, who was given Asian eye makeup prosthetics to play an Asian character, which is super weird. That is also true of Dr. No, and we'll talk about that when he's revealed. Mercifully, neither of these characters are acted with stereotype caricature as Mickey Rooney in Breakfast at Tiffany's, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But it is supremely effed up that neither of these characters, who are meant to be of Chinese, or in Dr. No's case, Chinese and German heritage, are remotely that heritage themselves.
Yeah.
To the extent that surely it would be cheaper to simply find a Chinese actress rather than take someone and give them prosthetic eye makeup.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, yeah. So the secretary of the chief secretary is herself, it turns out, a double agent of Dr. No, and in conversation with Dent. So Bond manages to sort of like parlay his way into a date, and then leverages that into going to her house. She gets a message telling her to like occupy him for a couple of hours until they can basically send somebody up to liquidate him.
Well, because they try to kill him on the way there.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, he gets into a car chase on the way there.
There's a car chase, and he manages to, through the miracle of rear projection, not actually Sean Connery driving on a dangerous road, special effects technology, manage to make the car chasing him fly off the road into a fiery ball of metal at the bottom of a cliff.
That's right. It's a very good exploding car crash.
A bunch of the early Bond films, when they did start really turning them out, they used a lot of rear projection stuff that is like the only part of these early ones that really doesn't hold up. This is the only shot of it in this one, is the driving under the crane of the road working machine that ends up causing this sort of weird collision. So it's the only part of this movie where I was like, oh, that looks a bit naff.
Yeah, that particular effect looks a bit dated, and like just the projection angle is super weird relative to where the car is in relation to the digging machine or the crane. Absolutely. I think my favorite part of this scene though is Sean Connery acting like he's driving. It's like he's sitting behind the wheel just like going ham. And not like, sometimes he's in sync and you're like, oh, okay. Like I assume they just took like a whole bunch of video and just tried to grab the takes that looked the most like he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. But in a lot of those takes, he does not look that much like he's turning the wheel right when the car is going left.
Character on a multi-camera sitcom playing a video game.
Yeah. It's fun. Like, don't get me wrong. I love the scene because it's like super fun just watching Sean Connery like, I'm acting. But it does not really hold up super well.
Mm-hmm. When Miss Taro is very surprised to see this very alive James Bond show up at her house, then she's given the instructions that she has to keep him there for some time until they can get someone to come out there and kill him.
Right. And so keep him busy, she does.
They do a sex.
They do. You come to understand why he's doing it, but the conversation at the end of that, like at the end of their coitus, is like he really railroads his like desires into what they're going to do for dinner. He is like, so shall we go out for dinner? And she's like, no, I think I'll cook something. And he's like, no, we're going out for dinner. And she's like, I'll make you a nice Chinese dish. And he's like, that's nonsense. We're going out for dinner. Put something nice on. I'll call a cab. And then she's like, didn't you drive here? It's like, well, the thing won't start. So I'm going to call a cab, get ready for dinner.
It does sound like a conversation that a couple might have 3 years into a not particularly healthy relationship.
Yeah.
What do you want for dinner? I'll just make something. No, we're going out. No, I can make like, I don't know, I'll make like Chinese or something. I'm calling a cab. We're going out to dinner. Just like
yeah. Not only like we're going out, but like no, that's a terrible idea. We're going out.
Yeah.
So anyhow, the cab arrives. They both get dressed. Bond puts her in the cab and then sends the cab away and turns around and goes back into the house.
It's not a cab either. It's the car with the chief of security for Government House.
Oh, that's right. It's not the cab. He has in fact just called somebody to take her away. So yeah, he grabs he sends her away and goes back into the house and sets up a trap for the person that he is sure is coming to kill him at this point. An hour or two passes as he sits there waiting, playing solitaire with himself. Lo and behold, the door to the bedroom opens and a gun points through the door and fires several bullets into the pillows that Bond has carefully arranged on the bed to look like a sleeping body. Bond springs his trap, and lo and behold, the person conducting this assassination attempt is none other than Professor Dent himself. So then they get into a big conversation where it's essentially Bond learns everything he needs to know about Dent's motivations and what's going on and who he's working for. Dent tries to go for his gun again, actually succeeds at going for his gun, pulls the trigger at Bond, only to hear a click. Mm-hmm. And Bond comments on the fact that given the model of gun, he's already used his 6, and then kills him, and we end the scene. And he moves on.
The ruthless murder in cold blood of an enemy of the crown is, you think that that's a much more recent, that's like a Daniel Craig or maybe a Timothy Dalton era kind of, hard-bitten, gritty James Bond. But no, he's always been like that.
Yeah. It's maybe filmed a little more like grittily in more recent incarnations, but yeah, no, it's straight up like, nope, you're dead now.
Yeah, because it's like Bond isn't a nice guy to bad guys, right? I mean, he's not a nice guy to lots of people, honestly. He's not a nice guy. We talked about this at the beginning.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like, okay, I've gotten all my information. You've been responsible for several people dying. Okay, you can die now.
Yep.
He has a license for it and everything.
He does. Okay, so we're now like halfway through the movie. We're a little further than that. I think we're like 2/3 through the movie. So anyhow, at this point, he ropes Quarrel into taking him to Crab Key. He's decided that Dr. No is clearly up to no good, and he's got to pay him a visit. So after some protestation, Quarrel does finally agree to take him to Crab Key. They get onto the beach. On the beach, they discover Honey Rider, who is a woman who is there, who's not supposed to be there, but who is also there, and she is collecting shells. And the presence of Honey Rider on the beach trips Bond to the fact that the radar that they're using on the island to identify visitors will probably know that they're there. She insists that, I come here all the time. They're never able to catch me. But he knows that because they're suspicious, Bond has been snooping around. They will turn up this time and begin the hunt. And lo and behold, the hunt begins. A gunship comes up the beach and announces that, we know you're there. Come out with your hands up and nobody will get hurt.
That's a lie.
It is a lie. They shoot up the beach, but Bond and crew manage to avoid capture at this point, and so they begin to make their way. They're like, all right, well, Honey Rider, you need to get off the island. Where is your boat? And they go to find her boat, and it's full of bullet holes, naturally. So she ends up having to tag along with them, but she finds them a route into the island that will prevent them from being tracked by the dogs.
It's worth talking a little bit about the introduction of Honey Rider, because it is considered one of the quintessential shots in the James Bond canon of Honey Rider, played by Ursula Andress, appearing out of the water in her strange-looking bikini, to the extent that it's even been referenced internally by the Bond franchise later with Halle Berry in a very similar bikini. It's so odd the way that they would cast for these early Bond films. Literally, the producers saw a picture of Ursula Andress that her husband, who's a photographer, had taken, and were like, great, she'll play Honey Rider. And it's like, what? But she has, like, she can speak English, but she has an incredibly thick accent. Don't worry, we'll dub her over. Like in later Connery and even some of the Roger Moore films, the primary love interest character would be someone from a beauty pageant or, you know, Miss Italy 1967 or something. And they were like, great, cast her in the movie. Can she speak English? Doesn't matter. We'll dub her over. And it's just in the same vein as the makeup thing. Surely you could just find attractive people that you don't need to dub. That has to be cheaper. But they were like, you know, they're just sort of, this was the 1960s. And so they went, great, get that hot one. We'll put her in a bikini and it will be fine. They had to get Ursula Andress dubbed with two different people, one for her singing voice and one for her speaking voice.
Really?
Yeah. It's just, it seems to me an inefficient system.
It probably is. I mean, it probably also does, like, it ties a little bit into the sort of mystique of Bond of, like, I mean, maybe it's the production team getting high on their own supply, but the, like, you know, he can have anyone he wants and so can we. Find the, like, model of the day or the, like, you know, the perfect physical image that we want to portray and cast that person, cost and consequence be damned kind of a situation.
At least for Andress, this was a star-making turn. I mean, again, because it was all about, for many, many years, it was all about complete unknowns. And she went on to have a career in film, which is great for her. But it was just sort of weird how it all ended up. The actress who played the photographer tells the story of how she was working at, oh God, was it the airport? And one of the producers, or maybe it was the director, were like, hey, we're making this movie. You should be in this movie. I'm like, what? Yeah, come on. Because she was attractive. Turns out she was like Miss Jamaica.
Ah.
But they didn't meet her in that context. They were just like, oh, look at this attractive person who we, you know, it's like literally the whole like discovered working at a coffee shop kind of thing, you know. That's
right.
It's very, very strange. Anyway, so yeah, Ursula Andress as the classic Honey Rider, probably the tamest of the nicknames of Bond's female co-stars.
At least for a while.
Sorry, the tamest name that could still be interpreted as a double entendre.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's fair.
Some of them just have normal names, you know, like most people. In the book, this character's name is Honey Chili Rider, like one word. Like
really?
Honey and then Chile, like the country Chile.
Okay.
Honey Chile Rider. I don't know why. It's very certain. They were like, that's maybe a little too far. Let's walk it back to Honey Rider. Anyway.
So they proceed up the river. They evade a couple of patrols with dogs. You know, some random, like, spy chase kind of stuff happens. Bond kills a guy, much to Honey Rider's horror. Some time passes, and around about twilight, they make their way to a radioactive inland swamp, and here they meet the dragon. And the dragon, as it is a large tank. It has a flamethrower on the front, thus it breathes fire. It has two lamps, like, quite high up on it, which are its eyes. It has fins, like it's got like 1960s like arrow fins on it for some reason.
Somebody who works for Dr. No had a great time making a parade float out of this thing. It's got a face on it, like yeah.
They painted it all up to like they embraced the dragon myth with this thing. Clearly, I kind of like, just sort of in my mind, kind of like the idea that they had a tank that they used to dispose of people who were coming to the island, and then they got wind of the fact that the locals were calling it a dragon, and so they like, all right, let's take some paint to this. Let's embrace the lore. Just one of the henchmen had a time. That's none of that is in the movie. That's just all my own extrapolation on how this came to be. But we meet the dragon. They try to fight it. Of course, Quarrel with a revolver and Bond with his Walther PPK are not really a very good opposition to an actual tank. and Quarrel meets his end here, burned alive by the flamethrower. Upon seeing this, Bond surrenders to the tank, and he and Honey Rider are taken into custody. They are then brought to the lair of one Dr. No, where they are measured for radioactivity, and they are found to be extremely radioactive. And so they get put through this mechanical, like automated shower thing that decontaminates them before being welcomed in. They are provided, considering they were picked up by a tank and their compatriot was just murdered, they are provided a remarkably warm and hospitable welcome.
It's so weird. It's so strange. Just in a vacuum, it's strange, but it's strange also that this is the first Bond movie, because this is almost like self-parody, that they bust into this place, then there's this whole facility, and they go through this decontamination, and then they appear into a resort. Basically, there's like a concierge, and there's rooms, and there's room service, and there's clothing for all of you, and there's an entire staff, and let me show you to your room. You'll be staying here. Dinner's at 8. Come and, we hope that you'll join the good doctor. And it's just like, what is happening?
Yeah, my favorite part of that whole sequence is the concierge kind of woman walks them into the room and is like, here's where you'll be staying, Mr. Bond. And for the young woman, this will be your room. You'll find clothes in the closet. I hope they fit. We only just got your size this morning.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow, they've been doing the research.
And I don't understand this, because it's like they're trapped in the room. There's no way out. Like, because they can't open the doors, because the doors like slide and they're mechanically or whatever. And they're like, okay, well, I guess we just hang out here until dinner. You want some tea? Sure. Let's have a drink. And the tea is drugged.
Yep.
So they pass out, and then Dr. No comes in and looks at them while they're sleeping. And then they wake up and they're like, oh, guess we were unconscious for hours. Time for that dinner now. Like, what? There's no point. There's no point to the knocking them unconscious part. That's like, from like a plot perspective, I think that's my weirdest. It's just like, just so they wouldn't be bored in the room.
Yeah, I chalk it up to like just keeping them out of trouble, right? Like,
I guess
it's one of those things that like it truly does not make sense even in the context of the film.
Move up the meeting, have them over for lunch.
Yeah, you could do that, but like as established a little later in the movie, they put James Bond in a literal prison cell with an actual electrified grate over the airway, and he still manages to break out, right? So presumably their somewhat lower security hotel room with an outside locked door is not any more likely to hold him. Maybe knocking them out with a drugged tea is, just easier than risking that they, make trouble. Although then why didn't they knock out Bond when they put him in the prison cell later? Who knows? You just got to take that one sort of on the terms the film presents it. But my favorite thing about that scene is that not only do they knock them out, but Dr. No is clearly their second visitor, because they both pass out. Like Honey Rider passes out on the couch and Bond passes out on the floor. And then the next time we see him, he's sound asleep, tucked into his bed like a little burrito. Yeah. So to the extent that Dr. No has to like pull down the sheets to see his face, he looks so cozy.
He does.
He looks so cozy. He's just having the sleep of his life. Anyhow, they head out to dinner. Now we finally get Bond face to face with Dr. No.
This set is amazing. The Dr. No's sort of, sanctum is this just astonishing big set. This is another one of the ones of Ken Adams on Pinewood Film Studio. Just this big, like, natural rock and mid-century, but like filled with these Chinese antiques. It's just this. It's a really, really cool space. Two fun pieces of trivia I want to talk about: the giant fish tank, which Dr. No mentions. He's like, well, the glass is incredibly thick, hence the magnification effect, because the fish look really large. That's because they didn't have any better stock footage of fish to use. They found that footage the day before filming, and they were like, well, if it's both solvent and dialogue, it's magnification because the glass is real thick. Wink.
Yeah. It's convex, 10-inch thick convex glass.
Yeah.
I like Bond's little quip in response, though, is like, minnows playing at whales.
Oh, it's great. It's the fact that they not only did that, but then gave Bond like a biting quip to work along with it is really good. And the other thing that my mom loves talking about this particular piece of trivia is that when they're going up the stairs to dinner, there's a painting on an easel. And the painting is The Duke of Wellington by Francisco de Goya. It's a real painting. And I don't know if you know this, Matt, or if I've told you about this before, because again, my mom loves telling me this story. This painting was stolen from London's National Gallery in 1961. And it was not recovered until 1965. So
Nice.
At the time of the movie's release, it was still at large. And so everyone in England knew this painting because this was big news, right? A painting was stolen from the National Gallery. And so Bond doesn't comment on it. He just pauses and looks at it and looks at Dr. No and goes, just sort of does this quiet, huh, and then carries on. Apparently, the movie-going public in Britain it brought the house down when it's just like, oh my God, the bad guy stole the painting. Like what an amazing moment that you couldn't recreate. I love it so much.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those jokes that's just sort of like lost to time unless you know, but that's hilarious. I like that a lot.
So we meet Dr. No.
And as you've mentioned, he is Chinese-German descent, former member of a Chinese gang, but he didn't really want to be, or not only was he a member, he was like a leader. Bond comments on the fact that it's notable that he rose that high in the organization, given his descent, and that it was unusual for the Chinese gangs to trust someone who was of mixed heritage. And he says, well, they probably won't again because I made off with $10 million. That is how I began this operation. And he reveals here that he is working for a secret evil organization by the name of the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion, or SPECTRE.
Which must be a backronym.
Oh, 100%.
We'll call ourselves SPECTRE. What's that mean? Well, you know what? We'll get Dale on it. He'll come up with something and we'll get back to you. Dale, what you got? Well, one of the E's could be extortion. Oh, that's good. I should mention, as we said before, Joseph Wiseman is Canadian, the son of Orthodox Jews. So definitely neither German nor Chinese, wearing eye prosthetics. And I just don't see either Dr. No doesn't have to be German Chinese. You could change that to be, regional gangs. It doesn't have to be working for the Tongs crime syndicate. Or you could get an Asian, but it's, we're recording this in 2020 and it's still difficult to get Asians cast in movies. So I guess not. I keep forgetting is the thing. Every time, it's not like reading The Hobbit every year, right? I don't watch Dr. No that often. And I always forget until he appears on screen that I'm like, oh, right. This is a white guy playing a half Chinese guy. I always forget about this. Sorry, a half Chinese guy with mechanical hands, which is
with mechanical hands indeed,
which is practically irrelevant. But it's just like, oh, also he has incredibly strong prosthetic robot hands. Oh,
he does.
Does that come up? Well, he aggressively crushes a statue at one point to flex on Bond. And no, that's it.
There's one other way it comes up.
Right. I forget.
There's one other way it's relevant. So anyhow, he has mechanical hands and he works for SPECTRE. And the reason he hasn't murdered Bond yet is because he sees a special panache in Bond for mayhem and murder. And so he invites Bond to join SPECTRE. And Bond is like, are you kidding me? No. So at this point, he doesn't use that language, but that's the gist of it. He's like, yeah, no, absolutely not. Dr. No sort of outlays his plan where his goal as, his directive under SPECTRE is not to work for the East or the West, because Bond sort of speculates that he's like, well, you're after this, you're trying to destabilize the space launches of the U.S. You must be working for the East. And he says, no, I'm not here for the petty contest between East and West. I work for SPECTRE, and I'm here for, I'm here to just destabilize geopolitics, basically. And Bond is like, you're in it for world domination. And he basically is like, yeah, that is the case. I'm here for world domination. So he tries to recruit Bond into SPECTRE. That fails. After dinner, Honey Rider is taken away. Bond is basically like, she doesn't need to be here. She's not involved in this. You can let her go. Like, just take her away. And he's like, no, take her away and like liquidate her. At the end of the evening, Bond is beaten severely by some of Dr. No's henchmen, and he wakes up in a holding cell, the aforementioned literal jail cell with an electrified air grate. Bond wakes up and realizes he needs to escape. He looks around. He finds the only access point available to him is this like ducting. So he tries to dislodge the grating over it and discovers that it's electrified as he blows himself across the room. So using his wit, he takes off his rubber-soled shoes and uses that to insulate his hands and bashes on the grate until it comes loose. And then makes his way into this suspiciously human-sized ductway. Considering he's in a prison cell, and you would think that maybe human-sized ducting, would serve as a security risk in a secure facility, but that's neither here nor there. Anyhow, he sort of crawls through this ducting, trying to make his way to foil the plans of Dr. No. As he's making his way through this ducting, he goes deeper into the island, and it starts to get hot because he's in like a nuclear reactor facility, and so the ducting is super hot, so he has to tear up his shirt to like insulate his hands against the heat of that's being conducted through the ducting. Then, because reasons, the pipes fill with water, and he has to like hold on as water washes through the pipes. I'm not unclear on why there was water washing through the air ducts, but there's water washing through the air ducts, and then the water goes away and it starts to fog up. It's all to illustrate that the pipes are hot, right? Like, it starts to fog up as the water sort of evaporates off the hot pipes. He eventually exits the pipes into the decontamination room, and there happens to be one henchman in a radioactivity suit walking around in this room who he KOs and steals the suit off. Now disguised as a henchman in this reactor, he makes his way to the control room and observes as they start powering up the reactor to disrupt yet another rocket launch at Cape Canaveral. He basically observes as all this goes on until such a time as they're going through the like pre-disruption checklist, and they call out the name of the guard that he's knocked out. Nobody responds, and then the control supervisor turns around, sees this guy standing there in a suit who is evidently still the guy that Bond knocked out, and is like, "What are you doing here? Get to your position up on the gangway. Why are you here?" So Bond dutifully runs over to the gangway and gets up and immediately starts sabotaging things. Like he grabs the big giant wheel that ratchets up how much power they're generating, I guess, and he like very gradually does it so as not to evoke suspicion until such a point as nobody's paying close attention to him, and then he just pushes it up past the danger marker, which is helpfully there.
I believe the gauge is labeled danger level, which is very helpful. I also want to, again, I have to point out this amazing Ken Adams set, this like huge thing with these like flying buttress support beams, just this awesome set with like a self-illuminated globe in the middle of it. Really, really cool. And the terrific costumes that everyone's wearing that, again, when they made Austin Powers, they just recreated these. Like they didn't try to make them sillier because they look silly enough. They're like, if we just wear them in a comedy movie, they'll look like a joke. Whereas in here, they're just like, oh, okay, sure, yeah, those are, radioactive. That's probably what people wear for it. It's the 60s. We believe that.
Yeah. It's so good. Everything about this scene is great. The pool, there's just an exposed reactor in the middle of this room in a pool.
Oh yeah, that's fine. How many Röntgen are we up to here? Not terrible, not great.
So anyhow, things start to go sideways as Bond has ratcheted the power generation up way past the safety level. Dr. No immediately catches on to the fact that it's Bond in the suit, and so he orders the other henchmen on the gangway to attack Bond. Bond knocks him out and throws him off the gangway. Then Dr. No runs over and they get into a fight. Of course, Dr. No, with his heavy mechanical hands, is able to severely, get some good blows in on Bond, and they end up sort of like throwing themselves onto the reactor apparatus, which is, as this fight is taking place, sinking into the pool. The pool, of course, with a nuclear reactor in it, is boiling super hot. Dr. No gets on top of Bond and like presses him against the platform as the platform sinks lower and lower into the water. And then Bond manages to get the upper hand and climbs off the platform, leaving Dr. No on the platform. And because the platform is just metal rails and he has these mechanical hands, he can't get a grip on anything to pull himself off the platform. And so his hands just sort of like slide helplessly against the metal as he sinks into this boiling water in the reactor pool. And so ends Dr. No. It's, the one thing that always happens in Bond movies, and it's another one of the formula things that they start off with right out of the gate, is the bad guy always dies like a hilariously gruesome death. The bad guys in these movies do not die in glamorous ways. So it's not gory at all. It's routinely very PG-13. There's only a handful of legitimately actually graphically gory deaths in Bond movies. And I think 2 of them are in the same film. 3 of them are in the same film. They start out of the gate with Dr. No sinks into boiling radioactive water and is boiled alive. Mm-hmm. So that happens.
Solid start.
They waste no time with the super villain has got to die a super death. So anyhow, Bond, at this point, everything's chaos. Things are the alarms are going off and henchmen are running in every direction. And Bond is like, all right, I got to find Honey Rider. So he runs through the facility and finds the concierge woman and asks where Honey Rider is being kept.
This is while the staff is trying to escape. They're all,
yes,
everything's going to hell. And he's like, where is she?
Yeah, where is she? And she's like, oh, she's in room 12. Here, I'll show you. And so you recall earlier in the movie, they walk down this hallway and she's like, oh, here's your hotel room. And you expect that room 12 is going to be a similar room where she's just being held. No, room 12 opens up and it's like a sewer access pipe, and it's another one of these clearly single purpose rooms, because there's a vaulted ramp down to a sewer access pipe, and the sewer access pipe is pouring water into this pool thing that the ramp leads into, and there's just 4 shackles on this ramp that Ms. Ryder is chained to. So she's just lying there waiting for the water level to rise and drown her. And there's a guy at a control panel in the room just sort of watching this and supervising.
Would you believe that is the less silly option than what they had originally planned?
I would believe it, but what did they originally have planned?
She was going to be chained down to the ramp there, where she would be left to be eaten by crabs.
That's why they do the shot of the crab earlier.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
But the crabs that they had they were transported chilled, and they were too lethargic and non-threatening. They were just we're crabs, and they were like, this looks stupid. So they're like, wait, twist her the other way, twist her sideways, and we'll say that he was trying to drown her. And I hope that at that point someone was like, oh, that was a much better idea. We should have done that to begin with. Would have saved getting all these stupid crabs.
The worst part is that she's not even head down towards the pipe either, right?
No.
She's still head up, feet towards the pipe. So Like whether this facility goes up or not, it's still going to be like a solid 8 hours before the water level is anywhere near her face. But that's neither here nor there. So Bond like KOs the dude that's overseeing her and frees her from the shackles, and then they run out onto the mining apparatus that is the centerpiece of like the above ground centerpiece of Dr. No's lair, and they commandeer a boat from two henchmen that are like trying to use it to escape, and they drive off as the whole facility explodes behind them in what is a great little miniature. The miniature that they use for the like wide exterior shots of the mining facility are incredible. They even did, like Meg commented on this to me while I was watching it, that like they even did a good job of like the scale of the waves with it, where like, you know, when you see a miniature around water, you can usually tell because the wave scale is all wrong, and it's like it still gives it away here, but the wave scale is good enough that it's like it's not so big a giveaway. My favorite part of the miniature is the little tiny boat. Because there's an earlier like establishing shot of this miniature just sitting normally, and there's a little tiny boat that's just tied up, floating inside the mine area, and that is the boat that they climb into and like drive away on later in like full size when they escape.
John Steers, who worked on the miniature, was given $1,000 as his budget.
That's quite impressive, actually.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, you know, I haven't done the adjustment for inflation that I did on all the other amounts I said earlier.
If the ratios hold true, it'll be around $9,000,
which still seems very impressive.
That's pretty good. Nicely done. It's incredibly convincing. The model looks great. So kudos, working on a shoestring budget. So anyhow, they make their escape on the boat. Then the boat runs out of gas, and they bang to occupy the time. And then Felix Leiter shows up with the U.S. Marines on a U.S. Marines boat, and Bond is like, "Oh, hey, you should give us a tow." You know, one of the Marines throws him a rope. They start towing them back to shore, and then they start making out again and slump into the bottom of the boat. And Bond lets go of the rope, and Felix looks back and smiles, and that's the end of the movie.
It's funny too, because it's like that's another one of those like classic James Bond goof moments that I'm sort of like, I was surprised that the first James Bond movie ends with like everyone has to wait what they're doing so that Bond can finish having sex with his co-star. Yep. I mean, they get more blatant about it later, but I'd forgotten that happened here. And does it say James Bond will return?
You know what? I was watching it at a point in time where I didn't watch through the entire credits this time.
Well, the end credits are very, very short. It's just a cast list because it's most of the credits were up front.
Yeah.
But no, it just says the end because they didn't know if James Bond would return.
I guess that's true.
That was Dr. No for quite a while, the shortest Bond movie at an hour 49 minutes.
Yeah, it moves along at a good clip. It's not
it honestly
like
does.
leisurely.
That's the great thing about these movies is they tend to be very well paced. Tend to be. So what from this was to you the most James Bond moment of this movie? This is something we're going to do for each of these movies. I'll give you mine because we didn't talk about it when we were doing the synopsis. When he pulls up to Government House with the dead chauffeur in the back of the car, and he gets out and says to the doorman at Government House, just sort of very casually and calmly, gestures to the dead chauffeur and says, "Make sure he doesn't get away."
Yes, that's a good one.
Yeah, leaving the other man to come and discover this dead body. And apparently that was an on-set, you know, ad-lib is the wrong word, but that was an on-set sort of addition between director Terrence Young and Sean Connery, and they enjoyed it so much. They were like, yes, this makes sense for this character, that's when they started inserting more bits like that, like when he drives the other car off the road and the bystander asks him what happens, and Bond says, I don't know, I think they were on their way to a funeral. Little dark, really grim one-liners to have this like moment of black humor, levity, kind of, that became a staple of James Bond. These quips that are, depending on the quality of the writing of the movie, varying wildly in like how well they land, but just that little bit of make sure that make sure he doesn't get away. It's just, that's, to me, that's the most like James Bond moment of this, which is surprising because this is the movie that has James Bond in it. But
yes, I was going to comment that, like, I mean, there's a ton of like the prototypical ones in this. I think mine was going to be he drives the car off the cliff and it's like, oh, they were on the, where were they going? Oh, I think they were on their way to a funeral, because it is another one of those like quintessentially like he has just done something like ridiculously dangerous, and to anyone watching, to the folks at the like the crane site, he just drove under the crane on a blocked road, clearly leading to this car like flying off the cliff as it tries to avoid the crane, and then exploding in a ball of fire. And he plays it off like he was not involved. Like he's absolutely stone cold.
Yeah.
I think they were on their way to a funeral, sort of like playing it off as if he had nothing to do with it. And I like that a lot. That feels like that is very James Bond. The sort of like the quip that's like, oh, well, they got what was coming to them, kind of a thing. Of course, yeah, you mentioned the Bond James Bond. We've already mentioned the bit at the end where like he lets the rope go, is also an extremely Bond moment. But I think this one, that's mine.
Nice. So how do we, I mean, this is the first Bond film I've watched in a while.
Yeah.
So, this might have to be more of a, rather than like a rating out of 10 or something, this might have to be more of an ongoing development power rankings. I don't know. Do you have,
yes.
where does this sit for you? Cause like right now is the only one we've talked about. So it's right there. It's Dr. No, it's what we watch From Russia with Love.
Number one.
Yeah. I can relate it in relation to this, but I like, this is, I mean, good for them. This was really solid. This is still just a good spy caper. And it's like, I think they started how they meant to continue, and they nailed it out of the door.
Absolutely. I think this is just a great movie. It's a great movie. I think it various aspects of this film don't hold up through a modern lens as they relate to like the casting of actors for roles that should have gone to Asian actors. And, it is a movie of the 1960s, and it was, in terms of content, it was, a little bit edgy and a little bit titillating even for its era, but taking it on its own terms and the actual like events of the movie and the structure of the movie and the story they're telling and the composition of the film, it holds up. Like, even by today's standards, I think this is like a really great spy movie. If they were to remake this movie shot for shot and like just update the more problematic components of it, this movie would kill it. It's just a great spy movie. So I think this one is going to stay high on my ranking for a while. I don't know that it will top my ranking past this episode, but it will certainly stay high on my ranking for a while. To answer your question, sort of like, oh, this, I don't really know how we do this. If I may insert some format from Countdown to Infinity.
Oh, please.
We have just done what I would call the thoughts and opinions section.
Ah, yes.
Which is where we like, what did you think? How did you like it? What were your thoughts on this film? We would then move into stack ranking the components that we're going to stack rank. And like with Iron Man, it was like, well, this is the best Marvel movie we've watched so far. Which, yes,
right,
this is the best Bond movie we've watched so far. It will also similarly be the best opening theme we've had so far and the best title sequence we've had so far, because it's the only one.
I mean, honestly, in those particular instances, there's no opening title song really to speak of. The title sequence itself was fairly uninspired, but Maurice Binder was just finding his footing. So it's going to rank probably dead bottom on both of those once we start getting more movies under ourselves. The other folks in the movie with him were quite good. I mean, Bernard Lee and Lois Maxwell are in so many other movies, but they're both so perfectly cast for their roles as M and Moneypenny. Ursula Andress did a great job. Honestly, Joseph Wiseman was great. Like, the Dr. No was really good. The scene at dinner, like, it was really good. It's just it's such a goddamn shame that he's not actually Chinese.
Yeah.
But he was really good in that, like, that the back and forth discussion with them was like, oh, he's playing it really, really well,
Yeah,
so,
he's sinister and threatening and like,
but really calm and measured, and just like, this guy knows exactly what he's doing, and so, yeah, I mean, Dr. No himself as a Bond villain is going to be up there, I think, at least for a little while as well. The soundtrack, I think we have the Bond theme, and that's like all that there really is to note. We haven't gotten a lot of the quintessential Bond music happening in this one, but I mean the James Bond theme is, it's iconic for a reason. It's real good.
Yeah.
So there you go. There's the first episode of From Rewatch with Love for Dr. No. Obviously, next one will be 1963's From Russia with Love. We talked about many different names we could use for the podcast, but we like that one because it's obviously James Bond, it's obviously Rewatch, and it's positive because we do love these movies, even the parts that are very strange or possibly bad. So thank you for joining us for this first episode of From Rewatch with Love, and hopefully you will join us for the future episodes as we go through. See, Matt has a spreadsheet. We go through the other 23 Eon Productions James Bond films and 2 bonus episodes, which will bring us up to, if it doesn't get pushed back again, the release of No Time to Die. Yeah, so thank you, Matt, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, this was super fun. I've been wanting to do this for a while, and I'm glad that we finally have the time to do it.
Me too.
This show, of course, as everything we do, is brought to you by you and your kind support of our Patreon at patreon.com/loadingreadyrun. Shoutouts to Featherweight for the art that you have seen as part of this episode. And thanks to Heather for doing sort of YouTube and podcast admin. And we will talk to you next time.
Thanks, everyone. So long.